You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Brady, joined back in studio by Billy Galenko. How are you, Billy?
Great. Glad to be back for another exciting episode.
Yeah, this is back to a little bit of our old days, the Vent Podcast in the first, 50 episodes maybe. Used to be somewhat of a blend between wine talk and market talk and investment talk, because the podcast was partially part of our investment arm of the Vent business. But now we've been talking to a lot more wine producers and like direct wine industry folks. It's good to have our current guest on today, giving us a flavor back of the economics of the whole industry.
Yeah. Mike Veseth is our guest today. And I would say it's interesting because he provides a great overview. We can talk a little bit about more who he is and a lot of his books that he's written, but he provides the overview and umbrella of the whole industry. So all of the folks that we've been talking to, whether they be producers or critics or importers, they basically fall under the general macro wine economics. It's a business, and Mana helps you explain it in a really interesting way, or he explains it to us. So I think it's a really cool guest and a way to kind of put everything in perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, just to give folks a sense of the scale of the wine industry, we ran across this chart from the American Wine Economics Society.
There's two A's. I can't remember what the other A stands for.
American Association of Wine Economists.
There you go.
Anyways, so the AAWE put out this little chart that Billy and I took a look at using Department of the Treasury data on how many wineries are actually in the U.S. by state. And it was pretty interesting. Did anything kind of stick out to you in the top 5? We have California, Washington, Oregon, Texas, New York. Was that kind of what you had in mind?
I think the only real development and this source that they shared was from 2018.
2018, so, that's right. Yeah.
Which I think is interesting, but it's interesting to see Texas even back then as ahead of New York. I would have thought differently, but otherwise,
I wonder if Texas has overtaken Oregon. I bet they have.
Overtaken Oregon?
Yeah, it says Texas had 588, Oregon had 701 in 2018. I'm just thinking of the size of Texas that they might have overtaken them.
Yeah, so I think the numbers might be different, and I hate when we're using a different sources, but I'll just throw this out there. I'm looking at another thing in wine business right now. That's a review of the wine industry that came out February 8th. And it says it has Texas still behind Oregon by half, actually.
Oh, wow. So Oregon's, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like, but I mean, the numbers on this other site are lower in general across the board. But yeah, it looks about to be a little more than half as many wineries in Oregon as Texas. And you have to remember that doesn't mean Texas isn't growing, but it also just speaks to the success that Oregon's seeing as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I think even though we're looking at a little bit outdated data, I mean, we could pull together our own thing, but I thought this was packaged pretty neatly. It does demonstrate just the sheer scale of these top 2-3 regions. California has a 2018 4,800 wineries. Washington State, a little over 1,000. Really just dramatically outpacing. Obviously, California is a huge state. It's our best grape growing region in terms of volume production, but that's a staggering number, 4,800 compared to number 2 at 1,000.
Yeah, and I would say in this even more updated data that I'm looking at too. I'll share this link with you. It looks like that number has grown a little bit in California, but it looks like Oregon has actually overtaken Washington now as well, which that's interesting to see. And I think what's also interesting to think about here is that wine has gone through some consolidation in recent years. The number of wineries continuing to grow in California is continuing, even though a lot of these brands may be purchased by bigger brands and are being consolidated, which is something we kind of briefly touch on with Mike, but it's just going on more in general.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see on the chart that I'm looking at here, number 7, Pennsylvania, then number 8, Virginia, then number 9, Ohio. Ohio and Virginia just right neck and neck with total wineries based on this 2018 chart, which I just think is fascinating given the proliferation of wine in Virginia recently and Ohio being from the outside, seemingly inopportunistic place to produce wine, but still keeping pace.
Well, I think that goes back to more of a historical culture of making different types of wine and wine from different types of grapes.
Sure. Fruit
I
wines.
have met, I have gone to like a little urban winery once in Cleveland. Like I know these things are happening, and the people have been making wine in some of these states since people have immigrated here, and then they've brought their winemaking heritage with them. So it might not be like mainstream and commercial, but it's definitely been plugging along for longer than we may think, for sure.
Yeah, heck, Alaska with 8, Delaware with 8. I feel like Delaware needs to step up. They're right there with Alaska.
Well, yeah, and according to this, DC has 7. So I think Delaware really needs to step up if DC is right there. No, I think this is really interesting, and I think it just goes to show you that the wine business continues to expand, and I think we touch on this a little bit with Mike, and we've touched on it with some other folks as well, that America is now the top consuming wine country in the world, not per capita, but by volume. So it's interesting that a lot of countries are looking to the U.S. as a lucrative market to sell their wines, whether it be exporting from their countries. And then in the U.S., rekindling some of this tradition of growing wine in your own backyard is also catching on because there's demand for it.
Yeah, and Mike provides a ton of great explanation in our interview about the way that wine markets move, the way that wine markets develop. And some of the macroeconomic, or even, we even talk micro and region by region and governments and time periods, but even talking on a macro scale, how global economies affect the wine industry. Mike is really the wine economist. He publishes on his website, Wine Economist. His PhD is in economics from Purdue. He's currently a professor, lives out in Tacoma area, Washington. He wrote some books that you've already mentioned, Billy: Wine Wars 2, Extreme Wine, Around the World in 80 days, Around the Wine World in 80 days, Around the World in 80
World in 80 wine.
Yeah, confusing that with another bestseller. Mike has a ton of great perspective and is super enthusiastic to be on the podcast.
Yeah, that's I had reached out to Mike about a year and a half ago when Wine Wars 2 first came out. I'm a big fan of his books. I read Wine Wars 1, and Wine Wars 2 really takes that and brings it to another level. So I recommend reading all of his books, but you can start with Wine Wars 2 if you want to and go back to see where it grew from. But it gives you really cool insight into just the whole world. And what he mentions in the podcast, and I think it's really right, is I've worked in many different facets of the wine industry. So when I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is relevant to this part where I worked at a producer where we helped create, they had a mass market brand and they also had a very niche brand. Mm-hmm. This is relevant to me when I was working in Australia and we were trying to break into the Chinese market. So it's interesting because he brings all of these facets without you having to work in all of these elements of the wine industry. So he said he's had both people who had no idea about the wine industry, just work in other careers, be like, wow, this is fascinating. I never knew. I look at the wine wall in the grocery store and I'll never look at it the same again. But then also people who are in the industry like us, also it was insightful for me and it's really entertaining. So I thought that was really fascinating. I also love his book on Extreme Wine. It's a little older now, but it was a really cool, he really goes to the limits of wine, whether it be like the cheapest wine possible or most expensive, or talks about celebrity wines, but he goes to really the extremes. And then I'm just started Around the World in 80 Wines. I didn't actually know that before. I'm a big fan of the original book. And he kind of tries to follow the route that Phileas Fogg took in the book, the original Around the World in 80 Days. So definitely recommend those. He's written others. But yeah, I would just say enjoy the conversation and definitely go check out his books. You can get them on Audible, also in paperback. So, or I guess in Kindle too.
Yep. Awesome. Well, enjoy this interview with Mike Veseth.
All right. We are here with Mike Veseth. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Billy. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I was telling Mike offline, and we will have mentioned a little bit in the intro that we do ahead of this piece, that my wine career has gone everywhere from kind of bulk bulk wine creation in Australia, also premium wine in Australia, to a family-run winery here in the United States that also touches globalized wine styles. So it was so cool to read his book, Wine Wars 1 and 2, because they all followed my career. And then Extreme Wine is another one of my favorites, along with his other wine books. So we're so excited to have you. But before we talk about your books in particular, do you want to talk a little bit about your background, maybe your economics background, and then how you got into wine?
Oh, sure. I'm an economist. I started off as a tax policy expert. My PhD dissertation was on using tax policy to preserve agricultural land. And so I didn't know it at the time, but that got me a little close to a vineyard, although I didn't study vineyards in particular. And I became an expert on globalization. And the first time I wrote about wine economics and about the wine was for a 2005 book called Globaloney. It was a case of a set of case studies about how globalization plays out in different industries. And the name was What is True About These Industries and What is Just Globaloney, what is just nonsense that we make up about it. And so I did fast food and slow food. I did basketball as a U.S.-centered sport, and then soccer as a sport that is in the U.S. but centered elsewhere. And one of the industries I looked at was wine. And so that was just fascinating to me because I was a wine lover and I'd been thinking about the wine industry for quite a while. But it was a chance for me to travel and meet people and talk about the industry part of it, not just wine. And at the end of this, I looked at that and I said, well, I'm kind of fascinated with the global wine industry. And so I dived in and started the Wine Economist blog. And it's been all wine business, wine economics ever since.
Nice.
Was there a component of wine interest and wine love that went along with that? Or was it you found this category and just from an economic perspective, it was interesting?
Well, both, I think. That I really, Sue, my wife Sue and I, Sue works with me on these projects and she appears in the newsletter all the time. I like to say that she has the palate and I have the credit card. But the truth is, she has the credit card too. I ain't got nothing. But I'm glad that we both really loved wine and are interested in it. But I could have kept that as an interest. It was really that the wine business is so fascinating. There's nothing that I've studied in economics that doesn't apply somehow to the wine business. And so it's one of those things where I just never get bored. And of course, there's so many wines from around the world that if you get bored of drinking wine, well, it's you, not the wines.
Yeah, this seems like there's a lot of conversation, especially recently as categories like non-alcoholic wine, non and low alcohol wines have emerged and different trends around alcohol as we've had canned cocktails and seltzers and things like that emerge in different markets. I'm curious your perspective on some of the sort of macro conversation about the health or vitality or growth of the wine market, maybe just here in the US versus what you see in actuality when you survey it from an economic perspective. Is there anything to say about the difference between those popular stories and narratives and what you actually see as an economist?
Oh, well, I think that one of the things that in economics you're trained for is to look below the surface. And this is something that I learned when I was studying globalization, that it's in popular culture or when making policy, we tend to simplify things down, to streamline them so we can understand them. And the reality is usually a few layers deeper than that. So that, for example, there are a number of simple stories about the changing wine culture, and they all contain a kernel of truth. One is generational change. Baby boomers just drank more wine than other generations in America and around the world. And as baby boomers, a friend of mine says, age out. As baby boomers age out of the wine industry, that's a kind way to put it. That has an effect. There's an economic effect. Those same younger generations don't seem to have the economic opportunities right now. Certainly, they don't feel like they have all of the economic opportunities of some previous generations and are hit by inflation and have high student loan debt, for example. There's lots of economic reasons. I do think, and I was just quoted today, actually, on NPR, about this, that during the pandemic, I think some people began to look at at health and self-care and began to think about their relationship with alcohol a little bit more, which is why not only has wine suffered a decline in demand just recently, but so has beer and spirits, except for ready-to-drink cocktails for the most part. It's significant enough that the Financial Times of London had a report about the tequila makers in Mexico. Tequila was a big boom during the pandemic, and now those agave growers aren't so sure the market's going to be there in 7 years when they would harvest the plants. So they're hesitating to committing to growing some more agave to make some more tequila. So there's just a lot of elements of this.
Yeah. Well, hopefully those folks will just kind of grub up their Blue Weber and plant some actually interesting varieties of agave and make some mezcal instead. But that's neither here nor there.
You sound like you know about this.
A little bit. I've read a book and gone down a rabbit hole of my passion for those types of varieties of agave. But I did want to pivot back quickly before I got too far down. Quiche is one of my favorite varieties of agave as a side note. But you do actually mention in Wine Wars 2, the impact of the pandemic was unexpected. Since we're on that topic anyway, especially I think it was especially in the American market where wine with the global slowdown, basically everybody thought wine would see a slowdown as well. But what we actually saw was an increase in certain segments, especially the higher, more premium wines that actually kind of grew. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's it. It's an interesting bifurcation of the market because, well, Billy, from your experience working with fine wine producers, but also their commercial quality and quantity wines, that there's more than one wine market. There's never a one-liner in wine, so that and starting at about the global financial crisis, starting at about 2008, the gap between those two has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. These days, there is $12 is a critical line. The market in the U.S. for wines that sell for about $11 or $12 bottle equivalent is just shrinking. And the cheaper wines, it's just falling precipitously. And then the market for wines above $12 is still growing in some segments. The fastest growing is the $25 and up. So trying to figure out what is this? It's not, as my European friends, so my European friends think that American consumers are nuts because they see this and they say, well, they want to spend more money. They're just flat out, they've got too much money and they're just throwing money at these higher prices. But if you look at the wine wall at the shelves, you see that they're not spending more for the same wine, so they're not crazy. But for some reason, they don't like that old wine at the old price. They want to try something new at a higher price. So they're willing to spend more, but for something that's newer or different or they think might be better. It's interesting how the Europeans are reacting to this because for many, take Chianti, for example, that Chianti in people's mind has an image about how much a bottle of Chianti should cost. And even with premiumization, they can't just raise that price very much. Consumers are very resistant to paying more for the same thing in wine. And so what they're creating in Italy and other places is what they call IGT wines that don't say Chianti, but they have a private label that pitch an identity sort of brand or a different regional brand that someone will say, oh, that's interesting. I'll try that. That it's higher on the wine wall. It's more expensive. Maybe it's better. Ultimately, there's a concern that we're going to focus on the very highest peaks of wine, where the volumes are the smallest, and it's hard to sustain the industry if it becomes an industry only for the 5% or the 1%.
It seems like several categories in alcohol have gone up market a bit, though, right? There's this kind of trend in smaller producers of like craft beer, IPAs, that feels up market to me. Yep. I know more expensive than sort of the light beer and lager boom. And then even talking about tequila and mezcal, I would guess that mezcal is more upmarket average price than tequila would be. And like sort of the trend towards ready to drinks and seltzers, they're pretty expensive per drink basis. So it seems like the entire category, alcohol in general, is moving upmarket.
Oh, it is. And because of wine's peculiar nature, those same trends that appear in even seltzer, but also craft beer in that, are kind of magnified. With craft beer, think about the price difference between the cheapest and the most expensive. And it's probably 100%, maybe more, a little more than that. But the difference between a Budweiser and a Pliny the Elder or something is big, but it's nowhere near as big as for wine. A few years ago, I sent my university students to the local Safeway store, and I asked them to do an economic geography of the wine wall there, to look at how many different wines, how many different countries, to look at the cheapest and the most expensive, and then how many there were there. And they came back and they were stunned because to begin with, they said that they had counted about 800 different wines. We would say 800 different SKUs. And that was, of course, that was more than any other product category in the store. It was more than cheeses, more than cereals, more than anything. The selection of wines was really the greatest. They had about 14 different countries, which when you have to pick through that to get there. The cheapest wine was about $2 per bottle equivalent. It was a bottle equivalent because it was a 5-liter box of Franzia that they could buy with their Safeway Club Card discount for about $2 a bottle equivalent. And the most expensive wine was a Cristal Champagne that was $220. So $2, $200. It's just the magnification effect. And so both the potential for premiumization and the reason why people are afraid to buy less expensive wines. They're on the one hand, they're afraid to buy cheap wines because they think it might be no good. And they're afraid to buy expensive wines because they're afraid they're going to waste their money. They won't appreciate it.
Yeah, so you go into this really, really in an interesting way in your book. I kind of wanted to circle back a little bit to what your books were. Can you talk about what you have a range of books, so you can briefly touch on all of them, but I guess Wine Wars 1 and 2, I'd love to talk about what led you to create the first one, and then walking us through what changed in between, because everything's changing so quickly, you note, and then maybe what has changed even since you released that book a year and a half ago.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to do that. So Wine Wars came out of a combination of things. It was after I published Global Oni and started to study the global wine market, it was about 2005, 2006, and I wanted to do more work. And I was very lucky at the timing, because if it had been 5 years before, then the logical thing for me to do would be to put on my academic hat, my cap and gown sort of, and to write for other professors, because there is an academic discipline of wine economics. And I would be doing those sorts of quantitative studies and writing for other professors. But the mid 2000s was a period when blogging was becoming more relevant and important. And so I started the Wine Economist blog. The idea is that people call me the Wine Economist now, but the idea of the blog was that I would combine the Economist magazine, which is the world's most important, I think, international business newspaper that looks at business and economics topics, but also other things, that I would sort of marry that to Wine Spectator, which looks at the wine industry, but also within a lifestyle context. So it was the idea that if you combined Wine Spectator with The Economist, you'd get the Wine Economist. And so that gave me so I started to write about this. My very first column was a friend's family who had a family winery, invited them to help bottle wine. And I'd never done that before, so I wrote about it in terms of Adam Smith's division of labor and how you can bottle wine with a dozen people and all of that. So it was a way to reach out so that I could get to other economists, but also to consumers, but especially to people in the wine industry. And so it was great because I began to get feedback from people within the industry almost immediately. They would tell me what I got right or what they found interesting, and boy, they would tell me if I made a mistake. And it really helped me develop expertise, a network, and a voice in these things. And as a result of that, I actually began to be invited to speak to industry meetings. And so I got constantly learning, sharing, learning more through doing that. And so I was fortunate, and I was able to teach a class, a senior level university class that I called the Idea of Wine. And it wasn't a Master of Wine class, it was a Bachelor of Wine class, where we covered the geography, the geology, the history, religion, the science, the marketing, the globalization of wine, just a survey of these things. And Wine Wars was written with that in mind. And so thinking about globalization, the thesis of Wine Wars back in that it appeared 2010 was that there were three dynamic forces at work changing the world of wine. There was first globalization, and globalization that brings a world of wine to your doorstep, that generated that 800 different bottles of wine at the Safeway store. There was globalization that created global opportunities and global competition. There was, I called it the miracle of $2 Chuck, which is commodification of wine, that the problem of selling wine, and in order to sell wine, a brand like $2 Chuck had to simplify it in some ways. Of course, $2 Chuck was that famous wine. It's still at Trader Joe's today. And I think in some places it may still sell for $2, but it doesn't sell for $2 here in Washington State where I live. But $2 Chuck simplified trust in buying wine. If you go into Trader Joe's and you buy a bottle of $2 Chuck, you don't have to trust the vintage. You don't have to trust the grape variety too much. All you have to do is trust $2 Chuck and Trader Joe's, and they will sell you a good product. The commercialization and the commodification of wine helped expand, but it also changed wine. It's Billy, as you know from those two sides of your wine experience, it's a very different idea of selling a wine for the masses and selling a wine for people who are better educated about wine and so forth. So globalization drives it, commodification changes it. And then the final force was I called the revenge of the terroirists, the revenge of people who are pushing back in favor of local, in favor of native, pushing back against the global forces, against the commodification forces. And I didn't actually make up this three-way analysis. There was a famous economist, a Hungarian economist named Karl Polanyi, who developed a theory called the double movement, the push movement of capitalism and the pushback movement of social forces. And I modified that to talk about the world of wine.
Awesome. So that was Wine Wars 1, moving in, because you lean a lot more into terroirists. In Wine Wars 2, do you want to talk about a little bit of, I guess, how, because there many of the same topics, including the commodification and stuff was in Wine Wars 2. I guess what new lens led you to create more things there? And especially also maybe touching on something like the Chinese wine industry. I found that very interesting, how it's evolved since you've started, almost blossomed out of non-existence when you first started. Well, not non-existence. It's been around for, like you said, thousands of years. But anyway, you want to touch on a few of those things? Yeah.
No, absolutely. Since after Wine Wars 1, I think 2011, 2010, it looked at what I think of as the central part of the wine market. And I was interested in how that was going to change. And so the next book was called Extreme Wine. And it was inspired by the X Games, because I'm a little bit of a sports nut. And I was watching the Olympics and I'm thinking, well, how is the Olympics going to change? And I realized that they're always introducing new sports and things. The Olympics changes not because the center of the sports change, but because of this change going on in the edges. And the X Games was a tremendous example of that. If you look, there's so many X Games sports that have now entered the sporting mainstream. It's one way to change. So for Extreme Wine, I sat down and I spent an afternoon brainstorming all the different extremes you can go to in wine. And then I tried to explore those. So I decided what is the cheapest wine that you can find. I found it too. It was $1, Chuck. It was a wine that I bought in the European Union. It said it was made from European Union grapes. And so it didn't even come from a single country. And I could get a 1 liter cardboard box Tetra Pak of it for €1. So it wasn't the worst wine I've ever had, but it was the cheapest wine. Then the most expensive wine. And you can go stratospheric for those wines. That's always going up. I decided to think about the best wine and the worst wine. And the worst wine I found, I didn't actually taste it, but I found a professor who was teaching a wine false class. And she said that it smelled like if you had a can of rotten canned clams and you open that up. And so you can try to imagine what that would smell like. It just burned her eyes when she smelled it. It was given to her, taken from a commercial shelf. Someone bought that wine at a store and couldn't believe it. It actually made it through all anyway.
Was it a natural wine shop in LA?
No, it was not. It was. I won't ask too many questions about that. I did once meet with a natural wine producer in Georgia who assured me that mousiness was a feature, not a flaw. So I can appreciate what you're saying. So I thought about all these different differences. It was interesting. The worst wine, and for the best wine, I asked Jancis Robinson, the famous English wine critic. I said, "What was the best wine you ever had?" And she did not hesitate a moment. She told me it was particular Burgundy that she had on a particular evening at dinner in London with a particular person. And it wasn't the wine that made that the best wine she ever had. It was the memory of the experience. So that made me think that wine has this ability to unlock things for us. Well, I moved along through a book called Money, Taste, and Wine, and then Around the World in 80 Wines. And it was during the pandemic that I went back. It was 10 years after Wine Wars came out. And I decided I would reread it after all those years. And I don't know if that was a mistake or not, but I read the first chapter. And I thought, man, I still like it. I've read this a million times, and I still kind of like it. It makes me smile. This is good. Then I read the second chapter, and I said, I would never write that now, because the world of wine had changed a lot, and because I had learned a lot, and my experiences had changed. So that meant I had to write a second edition. And originally I called it a second edition, but the marketing people at my publisher said, no, Wine Wars 2. That's gonna be good. And they had named Wine Wars originally. I had given it a different name. So I went with them. And so I went back and revisited those same three forces, which had changed. The globalization, commodification, the revenge of the terroir. So I was able to talk about things like the natural wine movement, for example, that really wasn't on my radar. I was able to catch up with China, for example. On all of the books have had a chapter on China, and it was a different set of things in each of them. In the very first Wine Wars, well, the chapter on China begins with my first taste of Chinese wine. One of my college students, university students, had studied in China and brought back a bottle of 1999 Cabernet Sauvignon from a famous producer. And I found a tasting note online. And when I opened it to a student group to taste around, that online tasting note rang true. It said, you sniff this, going to be ashtray, coffee ground, and urinal crust, which meant that awful ammonia smell. Not that I spent a lot of time sniffing around urinal crust, but I knew what he was talking about. But then we also had a wine from Grace Vineyard. Grace Vineyard's, the family that owns that, is actually a friend of mine. So I was trying, and that was really, it was completely different and really unlocked things. And so I've been following along on the Chinese wine. I still have a bottle of that ashtray coffee ground wine, and I'm afraid to open it because I don't think it's gotten any better. But the wines have changed. In around the world in 80 wines. I was able to taste that there'd been a lot of investment from especially France, also Australia and Spain, but especially France. So around the world in 80 wines, we taste a glass of a wine called Ouyun, Aoyun, which is made in Shangri-La in the high Tibetan mountains. And it's made by Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. It's made by the French. We were able to buy it here in Western Washington for $320 US. And it was, of course, it was standard French quality. And it was just amazing that you would make a wine at almost 10,000 feet to do this. In Wine Wars 2, I go back around telling these stories and try to get back to a question that I'd asked earlier, which is the Chinese wine market boomed. And I wondered if who was it for? Because initially it would seem like people were interested in the Chinese market because they could sell wine to China. And then China became the 7th largest producer of wine. And so it could produce its own wines. And the period, it seemed like only a matter of time before it began to export it. Since Wine Wars 2 has come out, we recognize that the Chinese wine market has collapsed. Chinese consumption has fallen almost by half. Chinese production has fallen. I think the pandemic had an enormous effect. Wine in China is a social beverage. People gather together to drink it. They couldn't gather together for any reason during the pandemic. China had the draconian lockdowns. And now for the young, upwardly mobile Chinese population, economic prospects are not very good. Splashing out on a French wine, maybe not what they want to do. With lower wine demand in many parts of the world, I think we all believed that China would save us. And now it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So it's a story with a lot of ripples, a lot of impacts.
That's really interesting I think that makes sense. It'll be interesting to see as they open up again in any, I guess, impacts of efforts that the government's going to have to try to jumpstart the younger folks and getting them jobs. I know there's some encouragement for them to go back to the countryside and take other jobs, kind of like a reverse. One thing I really thought was interesting about the China facts too is you were mentioning that they did have there's been like millennia of actually importing wines to China, for like even as early as like Uzbekistan back in the day. I thought that was really interesting too, thinking that there was a culture of drinking wine to an extent, grape wine that is, in China previously as well.
Well, that's right. And during the early communist days, they actually encouraged wine consumption because if people are going to have alcohol, the alcohol could be made of grapes, and so wine or brandy or so forth, or it could be made of grain alcohol. And in the early communist days, when there were famines, grain was thought to be too precious to waste on alcohol. So they encouraged the wine drinking so that they could preserve the food to deal with the growing population and its nutritional needs.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the idea that particular, because we're talking about economics and some about macroeconomics and the way that wines move around the world, but it's interesting when you zoom in on a specific country and the domestic economic issues of a given time, how that affects importation, exportation in that place. Have there been any pressures like that here domestically that have affected the way that the U.S. has consumed wine over the last 50 years? Obviously, nothing like a famine, like we're talking about way back communist China, but here in the U.S., can you name anything like that?
Oh, it did. In different regions at different times, the politics is really a big factor in the U.S. wine market. I argue in both of the Wine War books that the U.S. Wine market is still recovering from prohibition because we had that period of prohibition. The U.S. was a wine drinking culture. There were wineries all around the U.S. and then prohibition brought that to a very bad end. People think that you couldn't get wine, that wine consumption must have fallen during prohibition. But in fact, wine consumption increased during Prohibition because there was a loophole in the Prohibition laws that said that private citizens, families, could make up to 200 gallons of wine a year for non-alcoholic consumption. That's what the law said, non-alcoholic use. And so people, instead of buying professionally made wine, people would buy grapes. And so grapes from California were shipped all the way across the country on trains. Can you imagine what a boxcar full of grapes would look like by the time it got to Philadelphia or New York City or Chicago? I mean, I think it probably was starting to rot pretty good by the time it got there. These weren't refrigerated things as well. But they took them, made them in the bathtub, made them where they could. And so bad amateur wine replaced decent industrial wine, industrial produced wine, and gave wine such a terrible reputation. As soon as they had a chance to buy beer or spirits legally, they said, forget that wine, I'll never get it again. It was sad. And so turning America from a wine drinking culture to one that didn't like wine was one effect of Prohibition. But then there was also the breakup. Each state was given the right to regulate its own markets. And so each created its own distribution framework and paperwork and so forth. And this gave us what we call the 3-tier system, where a winery sells its wine to a state distributor and a private company, but within the state. And then the state distributor sells it to a retailer or a restaurant, and they sell it to you. So a wine goes through 3 hands with 3 markups before it gets to a final consumer. And this is, of course, one reason why it's hard to buy wines frequently, that there is no national market for wine. It takes enormous scale and a lot of money to be able to set up distributors in every single state. And it's also why wine is much more expensive here than it is, for example, in Europe. In Portugal, the center of the wine market is about 2.5 or 3 euros. You can expect to find a decent grocery store wine for 2.5 or 3 euros. By the time it gets to a shelf in the US here, that wine's $15. And so this, although we have a choice of things, it changes what our options are really like. And so this is part of what contributes to wine being increasingly to a narrower base of consumers, people who can afford to spend more money for wines that have a certain quality.
Yeah, you touch on 2 things that I thought were really interesting also from the book. One is the kind of thinking about your New Zealand example, and economic factors really allowed that wine industry to grow. And also just the idea that New Zealand wine wasn't even really thought of much seriously 30, 40 years ago. I guess 30, but 40 years ago. And then now everybody, to your point in the book, has had like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And then the other idea that you bring up is the UK and London kind of being the wine center, the center of the wine world, was something that I didn't really realize until really joining Vint and trying to invest in wines and sell wines into the US. Everything does really kind of run through that area, whether you try to or not, which I thought was fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually, in Wine Wars, I give an address for the center of the wine world. And it's the address of the Tesco supermarket headquarters. And when the first Wine Wars, Tesco, which is a supermarket chain in England and other places, it was the largest seller of wine in the world. And that changed for Wine Wars too. They still sold the most wine in England, but they had actually sold off some of their supermarket chains in other parts of the world. So they're not the very biggest. In the US, the biggest seller of wine, I believe, to be Costco. And it is interesting in 2 ways. One is that Costco uses the Tesco model, which Tesco pioneered private label wines. Tesco's finest New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Costco adapted that so you can get Kirkland Signature Sauvignon Blanc. And this is one of the growth areas of wine these days. But yeah, it's for you and Vint, of course, it's the center of the fine wine auction world and the trading of the investment quality fine wines. There are other centers, New York, Hong Kong, and so forth, but it really is. But it also is where so much activity for supermarket and other wines. And the reason is it's a pretty good sized population. They don't make very much wine of their own. People have enough income to spend quite a bit. So it's one of the two targets, along with the U.S., for everyone trying to sell wine, to export wine. It's even a very big target for American producers. U.S. producers actually have trouble selling wines abroad because of the extra costs and so forth. But the UK market is a good market for many of our wines.
Yeah, and a retailer that sticks out for the private labeling is Trader Joe's. I think if they're not the first in California, I know they're second behind Costco, but thought I had read that maybe they had surpassed Costco. Just that idea fits perfectly into the rest of their retail experience, which is all about private labeling. Maybe do you know how they rank compared to Costco in California?
I don't know how they rank across the nation, but I talk about Trader Joe's in both books. And it's because I use one retailer in each country in each important country to talk about how that market developed. So that in the UK, I talk about Tesco and how they develop private label wines. In the US, I talk about in Germany, because Germany, for bulk wine, for very large, inexpensive wine that is shipped in 20-foot shipping containers in plastic bladders that hold 25,000 liters of wine at a time, big bag and big box. Germany is the country that does the most of that inexpensive wine. It gets put into own label, custom label, store label wine bottles, and the biggest seller there is a company called Aldi. And there are Aldi stores now in the U.S. The Aldi stores came after the Second World War. I promise I'll get back to Trader Joe's. The Aldi stores developed in Germany after the Second World War because they needed a ultra super discount store, bare bones. If you go in an Aldi store, you better bring your own bag because they won't even sell you a bag. People steal the boxes so that they can put their groceries in those boxes. And the two brothers that own Aldi got into a fight about selling tobacco. So they split the country in half. One got northern Germany, the other got southern Germany. Then they split the world in half, and they split the U.S. in half. One brother, they got the eastern part of the United States and opened up Aldi's in Iowa and Illinois, where people flocked to them, even though it was an unfamiliar German name, because they were happy to pay ultra discount prices for decent goods. And the other brother bought Trader Joe's. And the reason why Trader Joe's has all those store label wines and why it has all those store label products like Trader Giuseppe's olive oil and so forth is because it's really a German company with its surfer dude sort of togs. Yeah, but they sell so much wine. They are terrific.
Two parts of that story I love. Well, Brady, I was telling Mike before we got on, actually, when I was in Australia, I used to have to fill up those big plastic bladders. I would climb a shipping container and tape them up and then dump it in. So I have firsthand experience in those guys. But the other part was the idea of Costco's wine program. I think you mentioned in your book that somebody, either a former Tesco employee or somebody with knowledge of that space, or it might have been an MW actually went to Costco and was like, hey, I have an idea. You should do this. And then that kind of spurred how their wine program was
that's
shaped.
Right. It was, in fact, a former wine director at Tesco.
That's what it was.
Who came on. He was kind of an interesting guy because he did so many different things, but he also did that. So if you go to Safeway, that one Safeway had 800 wines in it. And I wrote about it on the Wine Economist. And apparently the store manager read that he had 800 different wines and hadn't really realized that. And he said, that's not really enough. Because the store across the street had 1,600 different wines. And the farm store a mile away had 3,000 different wines. So they went from 800 to 1,200 for this. I've forgotten my point. I
was asking about the guy who helped develop the Costco program.
That's right. And so what's so interesting is where everybody else is going more and more and more, what they decided to do at Costco is, first of all, having the Kirkland signature brands, but also that they would have a small, much smaller wine wall. The typical store now has 150 or fewer wines. So maybe 1/10 of what a Kroger store or a Ralph's store, about 1/10 of the selection. And unlike Ralph's or Kroger or Safeway, they run out. So they will contract with really good wineries for very small runs in some cases. So they create a treasure hunt atmosphere. You go to Costco and you see that wine. I understand that there's been some screaming eagle at some Costco stores recently, that they're selling it for about $3,200 a bottle, which is less than apparently what you can get it at an auction or something. Anyway, you see it there, and you think, if I don't buy it now, it probably won't be there next time. If I buy just one bottle, I'm going to regret not buying 6 bottles. And so you end up with the treasure hunt. You're constantly looking. You go back again and again and again. If you see something you might like, you stock up. It is interesting how instead of adapting to us, it's training us to be the kind of Costco shopper they really want.
Yeah. And I love the idea that just Costco didn't really have much of a wine program, and some guys like, hey, you should do this. And then one guy has basically kickstarted this whole thing, and this experience that we all have. I thought that was fascinating.
No, that's right. And so Costco wine buyers are some of the most prominent people in the world, because you can get their attention, but it can really be worth something to you. But I have one friend who makes some wines, and he told me the story that they found out that in Southern California, which is a good market for his wines, that Costco was by far their biggest retailer of wines. And it scared him, because they said, what if one day Costco decides it's not going to carry our wines? What can we do? And so he had to revise their whole marketing plan, just because it was too much of a risk, too much dependence on one outlet for that.
Yeah. So there's two things. I want to eventually switch here to your notes on climate change and how that's going to be reshaping, and what other forces, I guess, you see reshaping the wine industry. But you mentioned one of your friends. Was one of your friends was it Washington State, had a wine called Secret Squirrel?
Yes.
Is that the right one? So I have one question for you. As I was listening to that, you said Secret Squirrel, the secrets are always mysterious. Everybody gets excited by that. I think that's true. But then your next comment was, and squirrels, what could be more fun than squirrels? Well, I can think of a lot of things that are more fun than squirrels. I want to see, do you just really like squirrels?
Oh, no, it's if you were to see the label, the label shows a squirrel in a big party mask. I mean, he is just rocking it, that squirrel on this. Yeah, no, it was interesting because in terms of branding, you've in the old school was you branded around the place. And so you'd show a picture of a chateau or some beautiful vineyards or something like this. And by the time my friend has several wine labels, and some of them are very much wines of place. But for this wine, which comes from Red Mountain, Washington, place in this, they decided that he wanted to appeal to younger wine drinkers in their 20s and 30s. And they're driven maybe a little bit more by identity. It's not about how the wine tastes or about where the wine comes from, because maybe they don't care as much about that as how the wine will make them feel. Will it make them feel like sharing, having a party, having a good time together? And so that was where the origin of Secret Squirrel. And I'll admit that he hired consultants to try to parse through how you would do this sort of thing. There are different approaches. One of the other labels I write about is 19 Crimes, which is a Treasury Wine Estate wine that has a picture of a criminal on most of the labels. I guess that has a picture of Martha Stewart on the Chardonnay now. And she actually did serve some jail time. So I suppose that's still of that. But the focus group analysis of that was that young millennials, young males, we don't need no stinking badges. We're sort of outlaws. We're renegades. And so we'll buy a wine with a criminal on the label. He was not trying to do that. And so Secret Squirrel, I guess Secret Squirrel is military talk for a spy or a secret agent. And I didn't know that. And so when he told me about this, I was skeptical. I was meeting him in Walla Walla, Washington. And young people, huh? They'll be attracted to this. So I walked back to the hotel. As I walked back to the hotel, I went past one restaurant after another, and there were groups of young people with secret squirrel bottles drinking it. And I thought, man, it's sending me a message. And it's good wine. Now, when I did Wine Wars 2, I was updating Wine Wars 1. I was trying to bring it to how the wine world had changed and how I think about the wine world had changed. And so then I began to think about the future. And so I added a completely new section where I talk about what I call wine's triple challenge. And the triple challenge are three sort of crises. The economic crisis. So it gives me a chance to, in one place, analyze some of the wine economics problems that the wine industry faces. And then the environmental crisis, some of the things that are going on there. And then there's what I call the identity crisis. In the case of the environmental crisis, in my previous books, I talked a lot about climate change and global warming and how vineyards and so forth would have to move. And so I analyzed the climate change in wine from a business perspective. I said, if you're a winery or winemaker or wine grower, climate change is a risk. It's an obvious risk. Under the Biden administration, it's even a business risk that businesses have to formally take into account in their filings for their corporations. And so I analyzed it in terms of how different people in the wine sector are treating the climate risk and how seriously they're treating it. Wine's identity crisis is how I ended up on this, and I think that comes today. The one of the problems within the industry that we talk about is that everybody's telling their own wine brand story. They're telling their 19 Crimes story or their Secret Squirrel story or their Franzia Big Box story, but no one's really telling wine story very well. And so there have been calls for some generic marketing or marketing campaigns to help people understand and appreciate wine some more. And this is exacerbated by the current kind of neo-prohibition environment we're in. Wine, I believe, as part of a balanced diet, wine taken in moderation can be part of a healthy lifestyle. If you do anything too extreme, wine or Cheetos or anything too extreme, it's not really going to be good for you. But people now focus on the alcohol in wine, ignoring the other elements of wine in a lifestyle. And this is quite dangerous. I think the World Health Organization said even a single glass of wine a week was going to be bad for your health. And so this is a tremendous danger. And if wine just becomes alcohol, then it's curtains for wine. And so we need to be telling these stories in a different way. There are heavy regulations about wine. A winery can't say my wine is good for you. And so we're trying to feel out how to tell our story better.
Yeah, I know there have been those alcohol brands. I can't remember the name of the beer company that is it called Athletic Brewing that makes the electrolyte infused beers and things like that. And I know that there's a few wine brands. I can't recall the names right now that kind of do the same thing. It seems like the folks calling the demographic who is on this health kick anti-alcohol is the same demographic that 10 years ago were spiking our numbers on Americans drink so much alcohol. I guess it's a pendulum swing, right? If you drink too much for long enough, eventually you're like, no one should ever touch this stuff.
I think I do think that's human nature.
Yeah,
human nature to rethink these things, and I do think the pandemic was this cause for reflection. Liquor sales shot through the roof at the start of the pandemic. People stocked up big time, and then they started to drink it, and now they're having these second thoughts. So,
yeah, locked in the house with your family with a bunch of alcohol probably isn't. If you drag that out for too many months. Before we get to a close here, I know we're coming up on time. I wanted to hear, you said your wife is the one with the palate, but it sounds like you drink wine relatively frequently. What's your what's your go-to these days? What are some of your favorite regions or producers or styles that you like to go after?
Well, people ask that a lot, but it's in my work, I'm constantly trying new things, and so I don't dwell very long on what my favorite thing is, because I'm always interested in the very next thing I'm going to open up. That said, I have given it some thoughts, and so two things I enjoy because they come in so many different. I really like Riesling wines, because Riesling wines, you can have them bone dry, very austere. You can have them off dry, medium dry. They can become very sweet. They can be balanced in all sorts of different ways. If I had a desert island wine, if I was going to be stuck on a year in a desert island, and I could choose all different kinds of Rieslings, I think I would never be bored. And so that's good. And most people don't look at me when I say that, because they think of Riesling as just being a sweet wine. And even in Germany, Riesling isn't really a sweet wine anymore. And then the other one is Pinot Noir, because Pinot Noir goes so well with food. So many people enjoy it. I have a friend, Tim Haney, who does a lot of scientific work on people's palates and what they like and don't like. And he finds that among red wines, Pinot Noir is a universal like, that it's not too tannic, it's not too acidic, but it has character, and it comes. New Zealand one tastes different than an Oregon, than a French, than one from Australia. So those are my two.
Nice. Yeah, I know you're deep in the wine world if you're choosing Riesling and Pinot Noir, because I think that's where it seems like where everyone eventually ends up. And I've heard oftentimes it's like the sommeliers of the world, their favorite wines are all Rieslings.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the end point for everyone.
No, and so many people these days are appreciating Sauvignon Blanc, especially New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So when they tell me that, I tell them, well, try Vermentino from Sardinia, because that has sort of that same profile of a high acidity and nice fruit and a little savoriness. And they do this, and wow, I like something more than just New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And hopefully it opens the door and they try something else. When I was teaching my university class, I had a few outside of class wine tastings. The first one was always 6 Rieslings, starting from the most austere, dry Riesling from Alsace to a very sweet German Riesling, but up through the scale of this. And I would tell them, you're gonna like at least one of these, and you're gonna hate at least one of these. And I remember one year I asked at the end, "What have you learned?" And a student raised his hand. And he said, "Well, I think it's about balance, Professor. That there are different balance points here, and some of us like this balance, and some of us like that balance." And it was great, because it gave them permission to like what they liked. And it gave them permission to not like what someone else liked. And I thought that's actually a great lesson for all wine drinkers. That who should you please? You should please yourself. You should find wines that you like, and you should enjoy them and try other things. But you don't have to like what I like or a critic likes or something like that. You should please yourself.
Yeah. I think everybody's sense of balance, because I was literally about to say that, like with Riesling and Pinot Noir, a through line of that is good acid across the board.
Yep.
But I know that wine drinkers or wine experts, and you got connoisseurs, they like more acid anyway. Whereas I do have friends who I give them a high acid wine and they say it's sour, and I'm like, you don't have to use that word. But oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Well, I know.
Also, I was just gonna say that the Vermentino example was great. Over Christmas, my dad had his first Vermentino. We were at an Italian place and I recommended it. And, oh, this is amazing. I'm going to go buy a lot of Vermentinos now. And he's like, where? And he kept calling it Vermentina. But I was like, oh, at least he's trying it. He's excited.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. About the sour wine, some of the research shows that there are genetic issues, that some people are very, very sensitive to bitterness, for example, and that there can be just a single gene that triggers the bitterness. So they will want a sweet wine, not because they're unsophisticated, or not because they don't know much about it, but because the sweetness covers up the bitterness of the acid to them.
Yeah.
And so it's people can be hardwired. People can learn about wine, but we're also all hardwired to react to wine in different ways.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And everybody should also get wine wars too, because when you talk about the Asian palates and then trying and what they would use wine with, my fiance is Taiwanese and she doesn't really drink anything with her meals. It's before and after, and it's all of those things. And I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. Everybody enjoys it in a different way. So, well, anyways, thank you so much for joining. We could probably go on for hours here. We're gonna have to wrap it up. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Brady.
All right. That was our interview with Mike Veseth. I hope everybody really got their minds blown in terms of the scale of the wine business. And then we'll basically look at things in a completely different way every time they're looking at a bottle of wine and think about where it came from and what it costs to kind of get there. If you want to go read more of Mike's books, or after you've listened, just read Mike's books, we will include a link to the Amazon, his author page there, so you can go buy the books right away in whatever format you prefer. And next week, we'll be back with another interview. We have one of the fan favorite guests coming back, Berghound. So get excited for that episode. We'll be back next week with that interview. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.